This lecture I'll talk about connecting to the Raspberry Pi using Secure Shell, so the server is running on the Raspberry Pi. So one thing you're going to have to do in order to connect to a server is you have to know the IP address of the server. Now, it's generally you don't have to be aware of the IP address, but with the Raspberry Pi you're going to have to. In this case you'll have to, because normally when I'm connecting to UCI, I know the domain name, right? uci.edu. That domain name has been assigned to that machine, or that set of machines. But your Raspberry Pi that you have at home, that thing doesn't have a domain name, right? You'd have to register the domain name, and that would be money and expense and all that, right? So I'm assuming your Raspberry Pi does not have a domain name. Now, even though it doesn't have a domain name, it has an IP address. It has an address that you can connect to. So you can use that and substitute that for the domain name when you connect. So you need to know the IP address of your Raspberry Pi before you can make a connection to your Raspberry Pi. So if you're going to connect to the server, you need to know the IP address. So how do you find the IP address of the Raspberry Pi? Now remember that we are assuming that this Raspberry Pi is connected on a Wi-Fi network using DHCP. So it can potentially get a different address every time you connect. By the way, in practice, it doesn't, right? Like in my house, when I connect my Raspberry Pi, I tend to always get the same address every time, okay? But that's not guaranteed. You can get a different address every time. So how do you find the address of your Raspberry Pi, or any Linux box, actually? You use ifconfig. So there's a command called ifconfig. You type that at the command line. It will show you, amongst other things, it'll show you your IP address. So let's see what that looks like. So ifconfig, this is my screenshot where I ran ifconfig on my Raspberry Pi. So you can see at the top, I typed ifconfig, and then there's a lot of stuff, okay? At the bottom there's a prompt, it prints out its result, and at the bottom is a prompt. The stuff in red is stuff that I intentionally blanked out because it's information I don't want you to see. But let's go through it. If you look at the data, it's basically 3 blocks of data. The first block is labeled ETH0, and that's the first block. You can see that on the left. The next block is labeled LO, and the next block is labeled WLAN 0. So the ETH0 is my Ethernet, my built-in Ethernet information. So if you look at your Raspberry Pi, of course, there's a hardwired Ethernet jack, an RJ45 jack that you can run a wire into. That first block of information, ETH0, is referring to that. Okay? And note that the information for that can be completely different than your Wi-Fi information, right? So you could have one IP address on your Ethernet, your wired Ethernet, and then another one for Wi-Fi if you wanted to. That's possible. So ETH0 is telling you about the wired Ethernet. LO is local. So that's just a loopback. So there's no real information in there. In fact, you can look at it has if you look at well, we'll get into that in a second. We can look at the details. But that's just local. And then WLAN is the wireless LAN. So that's the Wi-Fi adapter. And the stuff that I have in red, let's look at the Wi-Fi adapter first, because that's the main thing. If you look at the first row in there, HW address, and I have it blanked out. That's hardware address. That's the MAC address. Okay, that MAC address it's a number that is uniquely mapped to every networking piece of hardware, every piece of networking hardware. So when they're manufactured and sold, each Wi-Fi adapter, each wire adapter, they all get different MAC addresses. So that's that. But what we're really interested in is the internet address, and that's on the second line. If you look at WLAN 0, the second row, it starts off INET ADDR, and then there's a number there that I have blanked out. That is the internet address. So that number there, you can see its internet address right there. BCAS is the broadcast address. MASC is the mask. We don't have to worry about that. The main thing you want is INET address. And then you can look up at the top with the Ethernet 0, right? It also has a hardware address, and I blanked that out too. That's its hardware address. Notice that there's no internet number, there's no INET address for the Ethernet, for the wired Ethernet, because it doesn't. It's not connected to anything, so it has no internet address. And the local has the loopback, the LO. It has an INET address, 127.0.0.1. That is the standard local address. So whenever you connect to that address, you're connecting back to your own machine. So this is how you find out the IP address. So before you want to, if you want to connect by Secure Shell to your Raspberry Pi, first thing you would do is go to your Raspberry Pi, run ifconfig, and get what the internet address is. Then you can go to another machine. In my case, I'm using a Mac, but it could be, let's assume it's some Linux box, but it could be a Mac. I'm using my Mac, and I'm going to run Secure Shell to connect to my Raspberry Pi from my Mac. So, assuming I'm using a Linux or Mac OS X machine, it would look like this. If you're using Windows and say you installed some graphic user interface tool like PuTTY, then you would it would look a little bit different, but you'd put the same data in. Okay, so I'm using a terminal window, and I'm using the default Pi account. You know, we have a Pi account, right? Username Pi on our Raspberry Pi, password Raspberry. By the way, if you do this, be sure to change the password of that Pi account, right? Because if you connect your machine to the network, your Raspberry Pi to the network, everybody knows that there's a username Pi and password Raspberry, right? So you have to change that. So what I do is you can see on the window at the top, I say Secure Shell SSH Pi at, and then I give an IP address, which I have blanked out. So I didn't put the domain name. It's satisfactory to just put the IP address. So I put the IP address. Then it prompts me for the password. I type in the password, and then it just gives me it types some text, and eventually gives me the prompt. And I typed ls. You see, I circled the ls there, just to get a directory to prove that I am actually connected to my Raspberry Pi. I do ls, and it shows me a directory, which is the stuff that I have on my Raspberry Pi. So that's how you do it. Thank you.